Welcome to Our College Your Voices. I'm your host, Kara Monroe. Today, we're bringing you the seventh and the final installment in our So You Want to Talk About Race book club series. Because of a scheduling error, we were only able to have one final conversation about the end of the book. So apologies again to all of those who were unable to participate in that last conversation. As we've done this series, I've tried to think about what I hope for all of us as a result. What I hope is that each of us has found something that we've grown as a result of this conversation. I know that I have. I fail more often than I'm successful, but I keep trying and I keep getting back up and working to make the world a more equitable place. As we continue down this path, I hope that you'll continue to reach out with questions, conversations, and actions so that we can continue to make Ivy Tech one of the best places to work it can possibly be. Here's our conversation. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to our final conversation about our book, So You Want to Talk About Race. I am looking forward to finishing up this book. For our listening audience, I probably will explain this in the intro as well, but we had a little scheduling snafu with the other conversations, so there will only be this one conversation on the last few chapters. So apologies about that, and hopefully, as we talk about, we'll think about the next set of conversations here today. So we're going to start in chapter 13 of our book, which is called Why Are Our Students So Angry? And I had a very difficult time choosing just one place to start in this chapter. I had a note here that I started and said that this chapter was a gut punch for me. So I'm really excited to have some conversation here. So the quote I chose for this chapter is on page 182. As a parent of a child of color, you try to shield your kids from the harsh realities of the world when you can, while preparing them for the ugliness that they don't have the privilege of being kept safe from. I remember the look of heartbreak on my son's face when our neighbor across the street said that our Black Lives Matter sign was, quote, racist against white people, end quote, not knowing that my son had picked it out himself. So that's where I would like to start, but we can go wherever you would like.
Well, I notice we're a little group of white people here. The shielding from, I remember the exact words, but this idea that we, white people, don't even get it. We don't even see it. We don't even know it. And, that's a hard thing to kind of face up to, is that I didn't have to experience any of that. And then trying to think about my interactions in the classroom, trying to think about the interactions that I maybe don't get to see between students and groups. And, how do I start to, especially in community college where they've already got 12 years of experience in this, in our imperfect world, how do I start to unpack and recognize and acknowledge and make this a better, safer place for people to be and talk about their experiences? That's the big challenge, I think.
It is.
One of the things that not only is brought up with this author, but some other authors, is the children. She says on page 180, I try to let my kids be kids and focus when I can on basic intersectional kindness instead of the news of complicated public resistance. I think research is bearing out more and more that young people, little kids, are paying way more attention than what we're ever giving them credit for. And kind of skipping past any sort of judgments or evaluations. Some of the other authors I've been reading, and I was in a mixed, I was in a integrated school, and, supposedly being together helps reduce some of the racist thoughts that we have. And a lot of the research bearing out that that's not the case, that we still go away. We're built to tell difference. And so how is that difference constructed, and what do we do with that seems to me really, really important. And this chapter brought out to me, though, how much we need to be aware of that young children are paying far more attention and coming up with their own constructs. Mm-hmm. And for instance, on page 181, he's 8 years old, I believe. Mm-hmm. Yeah, 8 years old. And the chapter starts out with, because I'm an atheist. I thought, wow, this young man, this child is pretty sophisticated, thinking pretty deeply about these things, about race and his belief systems and all that. So I just wanted to kind of share that with everybody. I've made me reflect a little bit on when I was in sixth grade. I was sent to the principal's office because of some things I said about George Orwell. And so even in my own reflection about my own past, I think we need to pay attention to our children, whether they're our children. When I say our children, I think the next generation,
Right.
Our ancestors.
It takes a village, and we're all a part of that village to raise all of the children of society collectively. And we need to own that responsibility. I like that image, Todd. I was so impressed by her son. I think I'd like to just hang out with him for the day and learn from him. He seems like a really cool kid. What does this tell us about being educators? What is this? What do you take away from this chapter about being faculty and staff in a college? And Ben, you started to touch on it, but what do we take away here?
I think for me, one thing to consider is that sometimes it's easy to forget that the words that we use and the things that we say during the workday follow people home in ways that it might not go home for us. And so I think it's really important to be intentional and realize when we're commenting on other people's decisions, the impact that that might have for them outside of the classroom or outside of the workspace.
Absolutely.
I also think there's a harder lesson about silence that a student that I had in Louisville helped me understand. There was a shooting at Umpqua Community College. It was like 2015. That's in Oregon. And the college wanted to have a minute of silence to honor the victims. And this Black student was like, what about, honoring all the Black victims of police brutality? And I was kind of like, I was trying to do this minute of silence for these community college students, but it really made me think about that, how our silence on topics, like we come in and we're just like, okay, normal day, hippity hip. And especially in the last 5 years, like just news hits hard. And when we don't say anything, when we don't acknowledge it, because it doesn't, maybe we decided not to watch the video, or we, just kind of like, oh man, there's another person got shot and killed. That sucks. But I got some math to teach, so let's get after it. So it's hard. And I think that's part of our conditioning to not talk about race, to not talk about things that might ruffle feathers. We got a couple of students in the room we think might not like it if we talk about police brutality. So, let's just not say anything. And I think we've been citing for way too long on the sort of let's all just get along and pretend like it's all right. And we need to stop doing that. And it's, that's hard. It's hard to talk about.
I find that comment especially poignant today. Ben, we're recording on September 11th, which of course is a day of observation of the terrorist attacks. And it is such an important thought today about how we create space for memorial and reflection and grief as we educate. And thank you for that. Very good.
I'm thinking about her 8-year-old and how sophisticated his point of view was, and comparing that 8-year-old to the 8-year-old that I was once, which was a very different 8-year-old who was, completely oblivious to racial tension in the world around me. It makes me, I don't know, it brings up a kind of ambivalence about my childhood, which I thought I was living a charmed life at the time. And now I feel like this little guy had a lot of advantages over those of us that didn't start talking young about these issues. But it also makes me feel like part of our job as an educator is to kind of perpetrate a loss of innocence on children that grew up like I did. And there's something sad about that, but yet, I don't know, maybe after we go through this coming period, we can restore kind of innocence in all of us.
I like that idea.
one of the things that this chapter, and in fact, all these chapters we're going to talk about really were strong, I thought, very quality, but is how difficult it is for us to have, and it needs to be difficult, and to amplify what Ben said, we have kind of a culture of safetyism where we don't want to talk about difficult things. But on the other hand, we also have to be aware of that some of our difficult conversations might trigger some really difficult feelings. So how do we have constructive conversations about difficult subjects and not do harm? I don't have an answer to that question, but whether it's Kennedy or any of these number of things that I've been reading, it always ends up being, whether you're just talking about it or trying to take action, there's this tension of trying to improve and do the right thing and at the same time not do harm. And it almost seems as if it's impossible to not do harm. I mean, she even mentions later, and I'm sure we'll talk about it, that you're going to make mistakes. And so we have to be brave enough.
Absolutely. I shared with someone yesterday that while I'm developing that bravery around race a little more, because we have created this space here and we've been having these conversations, that having conversations around gendered language. I sent that out a couple of weeks ago in the Thursday email. That has been harder for me because I haven't had the practice at it. And so I'm trying to seek out that practice so that I get more comfortable with it, because I think that's what we have to do. We have to become comfortable being uncomfortable. And that is very, very hard to do. Let's widen out our conversation to add chapter 14, which is, what is the model minority myth? And I went all the way to the end of the chapter for this quote on page 200. We must be willing to fight the white supremacist narrative designed to divide Asian Americans from other racial and ethnic groups in the U.S. and to fight for their freedom and equality as we do our own. And finally, Asian and non-Asian people of color must stop believing the hype. We are not in competition for the biggest slice of the white supremacist pie. We will never be free until we are all seen and valued for our unique culture, history, talents, and challenges. I'm drawn over and over again to just what a wonderful writer she is. Her narrative is beautiful, and it's easy to read, but it's also challenging.
So to me, one of the things about the talking, reading followed by talking, is that we have to articulate and say things so that when we're going to hear these stereotypes and these myths, how do we respond to that? If we're not prepared to respond, we don't know what to say, then we can't respond. And you can respond. There are things you can say. So the reading is important because she has spent a lot of time thinking about it and articulates it beautifully. Now, I cannot just whip out the book and be like, wait a minute, let me quote you from Ijeoma Oluo's book. So I have to practice articulating and talking about what is wrong with the minority, the model minority stereotypes. And I think that's the model that I'm kind of hoping that actually can make a difference in terms of changing society, which is an enormous and ambitious goal. But I think that's how you would maybe do it.
One thing that really stood out to me earlier on that page was she said, if you want to fight racism in America, you have to fight the model minority myth. And this chapter really opened my eyes and made me realize that the conversations that I've been having around race with my friends and my family haven't been addressing the whole picture. It's been, just this small piece. And that really stuck out to me of an area of growth, I think, for myself and for a lot of the people that I'm having these conversations with.
Mm-hmm. I think there's, and this is a very American-centric part of the conversation, although I think most of it probably is, but that idea of the American dream. And I've been thinking about, is that just in and of itself a racist concept that there's one dream that should look the same for everyone, because I'm a good example. It's not my dream. I didn't want to be married, and that's, it just wasn't something I ever aspired to. And that's supposed to be a part of the American dream. Now, I'm white, so it's certainly not racist to me, but there's that anti-single thing in our country too. So it's interesting to me about sort of the whole premise of what America is built on. I guess it is. We know it's racist, but it's just interesting to think about. Not a really well-formed thought, but
I think that's why it's so, thanks for having this forum. There's a place to work through this. One thing we kind of have to get over is the notion of that having these discussion divides us into good versus bad people.
Right.
And a lot of our socio-cultural structures that we put in is that, oh yeah, there are some good black people and there's some good Asians and there's some good white people. Well, the construct is always based on the dream of America and white supremacy. You speak really well for a Latino. We're so immersed in it, and I appreciate having the conversation, because really I've got some good people that if I have this conversation with them, they think I'm calling them bad people.
Right.
I kind of go off track a little bit, but Eric Liu visited the Fort Wayne region probably a decade ago, and he's written a lot of different things. And one is called The Accidental Asian, and it made me pull this out. And again, I apologize for not having a really well-formed thought, but he's second-generation Chinese, and he is American. He doesn't speak Chinese. He goes into this pretty deeply, but his hair is a certain way and his skin color is a certain way. He's middle class. He's married to a white person, has a PhD, worked in the White House. And there's that push and pull in the book of, not being able to read his father's poetry kind of thing. But his whole construct is based on white supremacy.
The one time I have been called a racist, I guess it was indirectly, but it was by an Asian student of mine who was as graceful as he possibly could have been. And I so appreciated that encounter. I teach philosophy, and I can't remember anymore what we were talking about. But every now and then I'd casting about for an example from like physics or math. And this was a new class, so I didn't know yet what people were, what their gifts really were, what their strengths and interests were. And I was looking for someone to give me an example from the realm of physics. And my face, I turned to him and looked at him, and he smiled at me and he said, "She says as she looks at the Asian male," kind of under his breath. And we all burst out laughing. And in that moment, I said, "I am so sorry, and thank you so much for bringing that to my attention. And I hope everyone in this class, if you ever hear me slip like that, please do bring it to my attention." And I think it ended up being this really positive experience. But part of the reason it was positive was because, he was a member of a model minority rather than... He had pain, I'm sure. He was gay. He was a poet, and he fit a stereotype to many of us. People would look at him and think he was a math major. And I'm sure that involved suffering, but he didn't have the same kind of anger, probably, that people who are not members of a model minority, in quotation marks, might be.
Julie, I think part of what made it positive too, and to build on Todd's conversation, you handled it gracefully. You acknowledged the mistake, and you thanked the student, and you asked to be held accountable. And I think that is, as all of us think about how do we continue to grow, it is taking that growth mindset perspective and realizing that we're all racist and we're trying to not be racist. And so when we do have those experiences, it's accepting them, thanking the person who pointed it out to us, and trying to listen and learn. And that is so hard. When it happened to me early in my career, when I would be either indirectly or directly referred to as a racist in any way, my immediate reaction was to, hunch my shoulders and want to fight back. And now I can do it much more easily because I recognize it and I want to try to fix it. And I think that's what I hope we're creating conversation about across the college, and especially in these groups and these spaces. Yeah.
This chapter, I think, talked a little bit more about class than I think some of the other chapters. And I, instead of looking around trying to find it exactly, I think one of the things that happened with policy, I think in 1965, they changed the immigration laws to where we were actually actively looking for Asians to come over here that were essentially affluent, educated, middle class or above. And so I think she addresses that later, and as immigration continues, first off, they're not just Chinese and Japanese, they're all over Central Asia, Vietnam, Cambodia. But I think that we inadvertently, or maybe intentionally, I don't know, in the 60s, I think with our immigration policies, we almost set them up to be a model minority because we actively went after people that were talented and educated. And Eric Liu's father's case, he was in communist China when the communists were taking over, so he fled to Taiwan. He was very educated, a general, so it was fairly affluent. And then I think that's how Liu's father came over on that kind of visa. And then Liu's born and essentially is assimilated.
Let's expand our conversation and add chapter 15, which I find this title funny. I'm sorry, I just do. The title of the chapter, if you don't have the book in front of you, is "But What If I Hate Al Sharpton?" I just thought that was such an interesting cultural reference. I don't hate anybody, but Al Sharpton is not my favorite TV personality to watch. So I think that's why I found it funny. And so from this chapter, though, there are many, many wonderful points. And I went to page 204 for this one. Because if you believe in justice and equality, you believe in it all of the time for all people. I'm going to read that again because I think that should just be a mantra. Because if you believe in justice and equality, you believe in it all of the time for all people. You believe in it for newborn babies. You believe in it for single mothers. You believe in it for kids in the street. You believe in justice and equality for people you like and people you don't. You believe in it for people who don't say please. There are so many stars around that paragraph in my book. It's not even funny. I think this is one of her very best paragraphs.
This is one of my favorite chapters, even though I think it's one of the most difficult. And part of it was because of the conversation around Malcolm X and Martin Luther. There's a community college, Delta Community College in Michigan. Michigan has a big community college system. And I'm an avid skier. And I always listen to the community college's radio station. And they have a program called the Eclectic Chair. And for 40 years, literally 40 years, I've been driving south, coming back from Michigan on Martin Luther King Day. And I always tune into the Eclectic Chair, and they always do Martin Luther with his speeches. And then they put contemporary music to what was playing at the time.
How cool.
Yeah, it is. You're cruising along at 70 miles an hour with tears coming down your eyes.
Yeah.
And, but she really hits on something that we've cherry picked. Martin Luther was scarier than Malcolm.
Mm-hmm.
And that was, I don't even know how to articulate. I was just thinking about this last night, how to share this and see if anybody gets it or remembers it. But Martin Luther was effective. Malcolm was much less effective. By his radicalism, it made it easy to put things into a dichotomy. Mm-hmm. Martin Luther was a big tent. And so I think he was much more of a threat to the structure, to the culture than what people remember. Inside all of the peace and nonviolent resistance, that was actually a bigger threat.
Yeah, I have a friend who on Martin Luther King Day every year posts a letter from a Birmingham jail. And it always reminds me of just it was peaceful, but it was his work was so challenging and in so many good ways. Let's talk a little bit about tone policing. On page 205, she talks about, so what is tone policing? Tone policing is when someone, in parentheses, usually the privileged person, in parentheses, in a conversation or situation about oppression, shifts the focus of the conversation from the oppression being discussed to the way it is being discussed. Tone policing prioritizes the comfort of the privileged person. First of all, I think that's a really succinct definition. I mean, I was like, okay, I get this. I'm also guilty. So yeah, have done that.
Well, just considering what you just said, I'm wondering if there's some kind of a contradiction here, because we're saying tone policing is clearly wrong, but we've also said that Martin Luther King, whose ideas just went down easier, was more successful and more powerful as a result. So is that an argument for tone policing?
That's a great question, Julie. I think, for me, I think the critical word in her definition is the shifting of the focus of the conversation. But I think you have a really valid point that it could be that.
So not all conversations about tone involve tone policing. We could have a productive conversation about tone that stays on the topic of how to lift up people of color. Yeah.
Philosophy, it's a dilemma.
It is.
Page 208, there's a big flower next to this on mine. The paragraph starts with, there will always be people within movements that you do not like. There will always be actions that people within the movements take that you will not agree with. And then in the middle of the paragraph, I have it underlined, and I think this would be the author's point. When you instead shift your focus to getting people of color to fight oppression in a way in which you approve, racial justice is no longer your main goal, your approval is. Remember, this isn't about you. It isn't about the person in the movement that you do not like. So I thought that actually the line before that, I think, helped clarify for me. It's that shift of focus.
Mm-hmm. And I think those shifts of focus are so subtle. You know, as I've listened to different conversations about Black Lives Matter in the last few months with friends and family and colleagues, and I will hear someone make a shift from Black Lives Matter to Black men. And that is often when that shift of focus goes from peaceful protest that's appropriate and that is trying to challenge racial injustice to someone trying to go to this anger and pointless conversation. And I find that so interesting as a woman, because I always remain focused on the fact that the Black Lives Matter movement started with 2 women and not men. And so I think my feminist ears pick it up, but it's always that there's this moment in the conversation when it shifts and tries to make our racism comfortable, I think, or right. I want to make sure we leave quite a bit of time as we end the conversation to sort of talk about what's next. So I'm going to just keep expanding here for a little bit. And chapter 16, somebody else who said that these last chapters are just super strong. They really are. I think Todd, you said that. But chapter 16 is entitled, I Just Got Called Racist. What Do I Do Now? And I chose a paragraph from page 216. This chapter is for white people. Of course, non-white people will read it as well, and I hope that it is informative to most and perhaps validating to others. But I am aiming this chapter at you, the white person who is afraid of being called racist, who may well be avoiding further investing in the fight for racial justice because you know that one wrong move may have you labeled as a white supremacist. If you see even a little bit of yourself in this, you need to keep reading. If you are convinced that you are past all of that, you should probably still keep reading, because these defensive impulses run deep and may take you by surprise. just when you thought you had gotten past all of your discomfort around race.
I don't know what everybody else, for me, that paragraph was a gut punch.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because really, until the George Floyd thing, I was in the category of, if you are convinced that you're past all of that, I fit that until the George Floyd situation. And when I read that, okay. Silence is violence.
Yep. Well, I've been listening to Nice White Parents from the Serial podcast productions, and there's an interesting connection to model minority concepts in Nice White Parents. And I'm just through, I think, the first 2 episodes, so I'm not that far into the series, but well-intentioned white people are not necessarily doing good things. You can have great intentions and still be doing really bad stuff and just be unaware because you are not actually engaging in the work and engaging in the conversation and trying to learn and listen. And I don't know. There's probably more there, but I'll just let that trail off.
Well, she's pretty clear. It's not about your intentions.
This kind of ties back to something that we touched on a little bit earlier, and I'm sorry this thought is forming in my head, so if I'm not making sense, I apologize. But
no worries.
2 chapters back, she talked about, even if you're doing the right thing now, in the future, it's going to be wrong. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one thing with the sentence that you just read about, you're afraid that if you do one thing wrong, you might be labeled a white supremacist. And so, that's kind of something I've been reflecting on is, am I doing the right things now? And what is this going to feel like in 10, 20 years when I look back? Am I going to be proud of what I did? Or am I going to look at it with a whole new lens and say, oh my gosh, I was so wrong? Like, those 2 thoughts are very hard for me to connect in my mind and see how that's going to play out in society and, in our workspace, in my personal life. That's an interesting thought for me.
It is. I think we can have a lot of anxiety around making the wrong decision. But I think about what we'll read in the next chapter about you've got to move from talking to action and reading to action. And I don't want to make wrong moves, but I've made wrong moves before in my life. And at the end of the day, I've still made great progress. And it is trying to make sure you don't harm anyone. There's a lot there, Rachel. Thank you for sharing that.
I feel what you just said is exactly that. There's a lot there. And I think it can mean something a little different to each person, and it can change day to day. And it's, I think, probably something that a lot of people are, considering now as they try and make decisions on how they're going to move forward. And there's not a right or a wrong answer. And, for people that like to be in control of the situation, that's a hard place to sit.
Right.
Yeah, she has that line, your goal is to find out if you are being racist, not to prove that you aren't, and to resolve a painful situation if possible. If it's okay, I don't mean to dominate and talk too much, but I want to share a time that I was called a racist.
Please.
And I was in my 20s. I was working at the Fort Wayne Developmental Center, where white males were on the working floor, the minority, no biggie. I didn't think. But there was another 20-some-year-old person of color, woman, and we were pals. I mean, we would have lunch in the break room together, talk on the phone, work with the students. We really got along, and things were going along pretty good for about 4 or 5 months. And then all of a sudden, she wouldn't talk to me. There was just that hostile, there was just this uncomfortableness that was going on. And I kind of allowed that to go on for a while, but it just got more and more and more, like wouldn't even look at me in the parking lot. And so I asked one of my black colleagues, what's going on with Deborah? And she laughed at me. She says, you are so naive. What's wrong with you? I don't know what's wrong. You won't go out with her. And I had never, even now, 2020, I'm still that wasn't my intention. And I even said, well, I didn't mean to insult her or anything like that. And the person came right back and says, nobody cares about what you think. She's hurt. She's hurt because she thought you guys were really getting along, and she doesn't understand. She figures the only reason you're not going out with her is because she's black and you're white. And it was just that blunt. I didn't get angry, but I also didn't really have the grace to accept it maybe at that time. Mm-hmm. I was a little more stuck on, well, I didn't mean to hurt her feelings or.
Yeah. Todd, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. And I was the only one that didn't see it.
That naivete is something I've struggled with, like just not understanding or realizing or seeing. And I think, especially connecting back to the beginning of our conversation today around how much more mature her 8-year-old has to be about the world in order to survive in it. And as a white person, do I get to wear the cloak of naiveness longer and more readily because I just simply don't have to see it in order to survive and be safe in the world. I wouldn't have made that connection without your story, Todd, so thank you. Let's open up to our very last chapter, the end of the book. Chapter 17, I already talked about this a little bit, is entitled Talking is Great, but What Else Can I Do? And I'll take chapter or page 230, but then I'm going to take a little bit of liberty here and read the headlines of the list that she offers at the end. So I'm going to talk for just a little longer than I try to do sometimes. There is a bit of language here that I'm going to clean up for public consumption just a bit too. So talk. Please talk and talk some more, but also act. Act now, because people are dying now in this unjust system. How many lives have been ground up by racial prejudice and hate? How many opportunities have we already lost? Act and talk and learn and F up and learn some more and act again and do better. We have to do this all at once. We have to learn and fight at the same time, because people have been waiting far too long for their chance to live as equals in this society. And as we've read the book, we've talked a little bit about the lists that she has at the end of the chapter. And I want to read just the headlines from that list. Vote local, get in schools, bear witness, speak up in your unions, support person of color owned businesses, boycott banks that prey on people of color, give money to organizations working to fight racial oppression and support communities of color, boycott businesses that exploit workers of color, support music, film, television, art, and books created by people of color, support increases in the minimum wage, push your mayor and city council for police reform, demand college diversity, and vote for diverse government representatives. So talking is great, but what else can we do?
She's mentioned it a few times, and forgive me for centering myself in this conversation, but it's something that she's brought up, and I've wondered, because I think we touched on it a little bit earlier. We have to be doing better by the young people in our country. And she's mentioned a few times talking to your school district. And as a person that doesn't have a child, let alone a child in a local school district, is it my place to do that? I mean, it feels like something that I could do, but do I have business being there and doing that? Or would they be like, your opinion, please don't come to these, you don't have to, I don't know. That might be a really dumb question.
No, I don't think it, I mean, I grapple with the same thing, Rachel, not having kids either. And I'm not as active in my local school district where I live here in Indianapolis, but where my nieces and nephews live and where they're raising their children, I do pay attention and I try to raise points about that with them and talk with them about that. So I think you have the right, they're still elected in Indiana, we have elected school boards. So in that way, you certainly have a right to act as a voter in your school district there, and they're paying, it's our tax dollars that fund our school system. So I think in that way, we all have that responsibility. I'd love to hear what others say. Sorry, I'm talking more than I should today.
I was just thinking, Rachel, I mean, my children are grown. They're done with college, but This is an argument that I regularly have with people when they're like, well, why do I have to pay school taxes if I don't have kids in school? And I always argue because somebody paid when I was in school. And so I take it from the perspective of, I will pay whatever taxes I need to make sure that the school districts where my husband and I live in Indianapolis are solid. I want our students getting a good, stellar education. So if I have to pay a little bit more, okay. But I do think that it is absolutely fine to stay active, because part of our job as a community college is these are the kiddos who are coming our way.
True too.
And whether they end up at Ivy Tech or Ball State or IU or University of Texas, right? We want them to have all of these skill sets. And so I think part of what I took from what she was saying is, I think we live in a world where we believe that the only time we can be an activist about something is if we have a direct connection to it. And I think we have to get away from that. And we have to think about, but how does it indirectly affect us, our families, our friends? I have many friends who have young children. I just happen, that I started a little younger than they did. So, but it does impact them. And so like Kara said, your nieces and nephews and their children, we do have a hand in this. And I think one of the mistakes we make as I was kind of thinking about these chapters in general, and I think it very much piggybacks off what we've all talked about today, is I don't know why we're so afraid of failure. I don't like to fail. I'm type A. I can't stand to fail. But what does failure do for us? It makes us better. It makes us stronger. It makes us go after something that we didn't think we could do. And I think that's an overriding theme of her book is, if you're not getting involved in something because you're afraid of failure, then that's pathetic. I mean, I don't know how to say that nicely, but of course we're going to fail. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to say things that, as a teacher, I don't know how many of you are faculty, but I make mistakes in the classroom. How do I learn from them? I make the mistake and one of my students has a look on their face, or they say something kind of like Julie said, and that's a teaching moment for me. So I don't know. I was just thinking as I read these chapters, like Todd, I also thought they were the best, the most powerful of the book, although I loved the whole book. But the theme that kept coming to me is, I think one of the reasons we don't intervene is we're so afraid of falling on our face. Then fall and pick yourself back up, because that's the only way we make progress and the only way we do good things. That was very...
That was beautiful.
That was awesome.
That was beautiful.
Coming back.
Yeah.
So good. One of my favorite quotes is, if your life is free of failure, you're not taking enough risks.
Agreed.
That is a good mantra to think about these conversations about race and justice and equity too. Well said, Autumn.
Well, the authors are going in this too, is that they're not saying it quite this way, but I'm going to risk failure here. We've become very atomistic. I don't have children, therefore, I'm talking rhetorically. Mm-hmm. A lot of people will say, I don't have children, or I don't have children, so I shouldn't have to pay taxes for the school system. I'm a white person. I'm a good person. I've never used the N-word and I've never lynched anybody. Therefore, I. We've become very atomistic. And I think that that's a threat to society without hopefully not overstating that. I go back to Eric Liu again, Gardens of Our Democracy. And one of his phrases there, and I've used this before and then been called a socialist, is, we're all better when we're all better. I'm invested in your children. So to go back, Rachel, to your thing, I volunteer a lot in the community and I don't have any children, but I'm invested in you and your family. You can say it's none of my business, but we share the roads, we share the hospitals, we share the lake, we share the playgrounds. We're a society. We're not just these atoms walking around. And so I think that's his quote, is we're all better off when we're all better off.
Love that idea.
Yeah, we're all better off when we're all better off.
I've been feeling that so much more during the pandemic, that we can't stop this thing unless we all work together to, and I don't think we can't stop it, but we can control it when we all work together. And I've found that in trying to impart that, my language has become a bit more inclusive, which is the way it should be always. but in trying to say, we all have to do this together. It's made me more thoughtful about the language I use to try to be more inclusive. We're all better off when we're all better off. Did I get it right, Todd?
Yep. Yeah, his chapter on capitalism has been misunderstood. So for full disclosure, just before we got here, I took a little bit of time off. I volunteer. I'm on the steering committee for the planning commission, and I was the only one wearing a mask. Now that doesn't make me special, but on the other hand, I'm with the leaders of the community, and we can't get that much cooperation. Do you have no civic and social responsibility to everybody?
Right.
But was I brave enough to say that? No, I just wore my mask. And
the bravery is exhausting, but it's also important. And so maybe next time, now that you've said it, next time maybe you'll say something. So,
well, that's part of what she said too. Is that nobody, a person of color does not owe me a relationship,
right?
Because if I'm exhausted just by a little mask thing,
right,
what it must be like for those other folks are just,
yeah. There will always be a next time. All right. Well, I know you are a subset of the whole group who's had this conversation about the book. But I want to thank you and all of your colleagues across the college who've joined me as we've explored this beautiful book. And I haven't quite decided what the next project will be book club wise, but I think we'll probably do another one of these maybe in the winter because we're all going to be stuck inside. So we might as well do another book and do something like that. Rachel?
Because I just wanted to ask a question to the group, if that was okay with you, as we're wrapping up. I'm curious to hear if there are any, I know you mentioned that there could be another book club, but are there any books that anybody's read recently, any news sources that people have discovered, any just resources in general that anyone would recommend kind of as we're each going through our own personal journey in this? I'd love to hear if anyone has anything they'd recommend.
So we just did a book club on our campus, How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi, and it was fantastic. Mm-hmm. Great conversations, great attendance. We had 26 people in our book club, and they attended all 4 weeks. And I'm just amazed. Anytime you can keep 26 people without food. But it's a great book. He has a very different writing style, Rachel, than what this author does, but it's very blunt, it's very honest, and I think it really does cause you to re-examine the way that you interact. And Todd, I think I saw you hand it. Have you had an opportunity to read any of it yet?
Yeah, and I've done with that, and now I'm reading Stamped, which is a history.
Oh, yes. It's in my Amazon cart. But one of the things I would say, Rachel, that I love most about the book is his own vulnerability and his own willingness to say, as a Black man, I have been racist, and here's how. And it's very empowering. So I think you will enjoy it.
I think it's Layla Saad. Me and White Supremacy. It's more sort of a workbook format, and it's actually one I've been thinking about a little bit as a next read for the group. It's designed to be done over 30 days, if I remember correctly. Is that right?
28
days. And I think I'm like 14 or 15 days in. I do one every week or so. Really, really good for personal exploration. I was trying to find a newsletter that I subscribe to. It's called The Highlighter, but it's not coming up when I Google search for it. Let me see if I can find it in my search.
Sarah, what was the name of that book?
Me and White Supremacy. It's Layla, Layla Saad, Saad.
Thank you.
Yeah.
My Amazon cart grows by the day.
Oh, mine too. Mine too. But if you, both Ijeoma Oluo, the author of this book, and Ta-Nehisi Coates, Coates, Tanahis.
It is.
Is that right?
Tanehisi, and then Coates, Coates.
Ta-Nehisi, both of them write a lot for The Atlantic and other journals. So if you Google them, you will just have a list of articles. And Ta-Nehisi Coates' fiction book, The Water Dancer, is gorgeous and hard and challenging and beautiful. And do the audio version. Treat yourself to the audio version of that book. It is beautiful. Tim, Todd, you said, driving down the road at 70 miles an hour with tears streaming down your face. Yes. While I was listening to that book, absolutely beautiful.
Thank you for all of this.
Great question.
Awesome.
Coates has an incredible chapter, which I think is from the Atlantic article about reparations.
Yes.
So
good.
Probably not for anybody else, but this is the 50th anniversary of Albert Murray's The Omni-Americans, which is a way overlooked book that was published in 70, which I had read when I was young, but Henry Louis Gates writes the foreword to it. And that's how I got hooked up to this Coates, because think about that. Reparations.
And you said it was Omni-Americans?
Yeah, it's called The Omni-Americans, Some Alternatives to the Folklore of White Supremacy. And it's going to read dated, but some of its datedness becomes rather contemporary. I heard Kendi speak at the Black Expo.
Mm-hmm.
He's somebody you'd like to have dinner with, not because he's fun. He's not all that much fun, maybe. But one thing, they were asking him about what his opinion was on monuments and taking down statues of Robert E. Lee and that. And he was pretty clear that statues up, statues down doesn't have anything to do with taking care of white supremacy. He almost was dismissive of that's not going to get it. Just taking that statues down is not going to change structural racism. But you're right, Autumn. He's got a very unique style of writing where he's very open about his own. He's very self-reflective.
Yes. I don't recommend that one in audio, though. I don't know if anybody else has listened to the audio of that one. It's much better to read the book for that one. So
I'm just starting the one you recommended. Sad. Yeah, my Amazon account's blown up. So Kate Kramer is in a book club with me in the Fort Wayne region, and I will see if I can find it. She has a resource, African-American or Black owned business in South Bend that I think has free shipping.
Oh, awesome. Good.
Yeah.
If you find that, will you send it to me and I'll include it in the show notes?
Yeah, let me try to find that.
That would be wonderful. And Rachel, the Indiana Humanities Council, I did an episode on this earlier this week that's going to come out in a couple of weeks. The Indiana Humanities Council had a grant program earlier this year that the Indianapolis and Kokomo libraries received dollars from. And there's a resource list of both DVDs and books on the Indiana Humanities Council website about this racial equity work. So that's another great resource. And I'll have it in the show notes for that episode too. Thank you so much for participating in this and for just being vulnerable and open and great friends to have conversation with. Thank you so much. Thanks again to all of our guests for joining in both this conversation about the book So You Want to Talk About Race, as well as all of our other 6 previous conversations of the book. We've had some wonderful conversations, some wonderful moments of laughter, some really hard conversations, and it's just been a great experience. So thank you again to all of my guests throughout the series. We do end every episode with a call to action, and this call to action is 2 parts. First, if you haven't picked up the book So You Want to Talk About Race, I would encourage you yet again to do that and urge you to read it. I hope that these conversations have made you want to dig into it just a little bit more. And the second one is to put these steps to action, to listen to the things you've heard in this series and take one small step, one small thing you can do to make our college a more equitable place of belonging for all. Thanks again for joining this episode of Our College Your Voices. I'm your host, Kara Monroe. You can connect with me on Twitter at KNMTweets. You can reach us by email at ourcollegeyourvoices@ivtech.edu. Leave us a voicemail at 317-572-5049. If you're an Ivy Tech faculty or staff member, you can join our Microsoft Teams listener community. I send out instructions on how to do that every Thursday. Our website is ivtech.edu/podcast. Thanks again to our marketing and creative services team for all the work they've done to give it a great refresh. It looks fantastic. Production assistance for this and every episode provided by Becky Campbell, Sarah Ferguson, and our Ivy Tech Community College marketing and creative services team. Our podcast concept was by Matthew Pittman. Theme music and post-production services provided by Jen Eads at the Brassie Broadcasting Company. And we will talk to you next time on Our College, Your Voices.